Hello and welcome to NUMOA's Materials Management 101, How Markets Drive Recycling.
Good afternoon and welcome to the 7th installment of NUMOA's Material Management 101 for state staff. I'm John Fay. I'm a project manager at NUMOA and I will be the moderator today. This series is intended as a primer on solid waste management topics for staff that are new to their agency or would like to brush up on a particular subject. Recordings of past webinars and registration for upcoming ones are available on the NUMOA website on the training tab of the Materials Management program. Today's webinar is on recycling markets. Recycling wouldn't be possible without markets to use the secondary materials, but exactly where does that blue bin material go after the MRF, and how much are markets willing to pay for it? That's what we'll be discussing today. But before we get started, I'd like to review some housekeeping details. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and transcribed by Teams. Please keep your microphones on mute during the presentation, and the presenter will take questions at the end. Unless you have something really urgent, raise your hand, turn off your microphone, and jump in. We have the chat disabled, so we'll be monitoring the Q&A section of your Teams. So use the Q&A. I've posted a first post for the webinar there, and just type your questions in there and post them, and we'll review them at the end. And we'll be able to turn off microphones for audio questions at the end as well. Today, we have a fantastic presenter for you, Chaz Miller. Chaz hails from Maryland and is a national expert on recycling markets, and we're fortunate to have him here today. I think I will let him give more of an introduction to himself and turn it on over. Take it away, Chaz.
Thank you, John. Gosh, an overview. Very quickly, I've been involved in recycling since I started at EPA in 1976. Worked at the agency, then worked for the glass industry, and then for the recycling and waste hauling industry. I'm an ex officio member of the NERC, Northeast Recycling Council Board, and I chair the markets task force for NERC, which has led me to get very involved in markets and tracking them and whatnot. So what I'd like to do is go ahead and start this, bring up my slide. And let me see, I hit
the share button.
There. And window. Nope, sorry about that. See, Johnny, when we practiced it, it went beautifully.
Right, exactly.
Why is it not? Do you see my screen?
Yes, so you could just flip over to your PowerPoint and hit start your PowerPoint. There we go.
Yeah. Okay, are you seeing?
You'll have to click from start again. See if this does it.
Okay.
Oh, that's perfect.
Okay. Sorry for that. This is my first experience with Teams, so we're going through some of the hoops and trying to get it all right.
I know Zoom is a lot more user-friendly, but this is where we are.
Yes, it is. What I'm going to talk about today is recycling markets, especially as they relate to curbside programs. The data that I get all comes from a publication called recyclingmarkets.net. I use it because it covers all the curbside recyclables in one site. It's essentially MRF prices. It's just good data. It's good, well thought through data how they collect it. So you can avoid death by PowerPoint, I will be sending John at the end of this presentation a PDF with all my speaker points. There's a lot of data on my speaker points that I don't put on the slides because you just get slide after slide full of verbiage, and I prefer to use charts and photos to the best extent possible. But what I want to start off with, what are these and where do they go? This is a photo from my home county, Montgomery County, Maryland. We have a dual stream program. So we have a paper bin, we have a mixed containers bin, and we also do leaves, and we got a pilot program for yard waste. And I want to talk about where these things go. But first of all, what are them? What are them? That was a brilliant start. What are they? They're just raw materials. They are just raw materials looking for a buyer. And what that buyer wants is consistent quantity at a consistent quality at an acceptable price. And that acceptable price means that, quite frankly, both the buyer and the seller are happy. We're at that sweet spot. And the good news is every now and then we get to it. So I want to start off with aluminum cans, and they become aluminum cans for one very simple reason. Aluminum is extremely alloy specific. You can only make new cans. You can only use old cans as an input when you're making new pans, along with, of course, virgin materials, if you're also using those. What about the value? Now you're going to see a version of this chart for aluminum and 7 other materials. Start with COVID, January 20, just before COVID hit. Then we go into COVID. Things go down, then they go up. Virtually everything peaked either in the summer of 21 or the summer of 22. Then it goes down, and then they sort of bounce around. At the end of aluminum, you see, starting in December of last year, the price is going up rather steadily, then plateauing. Aluminum is 77.5 cents per pound. It's a very good market price for aluminum. That aluminum, it's a seasonal market for aluminum because these are cans. They're cans for beverages. And we consume more beverages in the 3 months between Memorial Day and Labor Day in terms of quarters than we do in any other quarter of the year. So what happens in March and April, purchasing managers, those people who are buying your raw materials, your recyclables, they're saying, wait a minute, I need a lot more can sheet so we can have enough cans when things really take off around Memorial Day. But the supply is lower because there's less available at the curbside because you're in March. People aren't drinking as much. Prices start going up. And then what happens, generally in August, prices start to go down a little bit because you got a lot of supply. But post Labor Day, the demand definitely goes down. So dealing with that seasonal reality of markets for aluminum is always something of a challenge. Let's move on to steel cans. And what can steel cans be made into? Just about anything that needs steel, because the primary way of making steel in the United States is a relatively new technology called the electric arc furnace. And those furnaces are designed to feast on scrap. It doesn't matter what it is, it comes out as a steel product. So I'm actually kind of hoping that someday in the future, one of my steel cans will be in the new Bay Bridge up in Baltimore. Steel can prices, one of the weirder ones because of the sudden rise in 21, peaking as did a lot of the others, in this case in late 21, early 22, and then declining, going up, then declining, and they've gone down again. They're down to $155 per ton. It's a market that's heavily dependent, quite frankly, on obviously on steel demand, but also affected by steel imports. And at the moment, the Chinese are just there's a tremendous imbalance in imports because there's so much production going on in China and so little demand in China for steel products. So they're just dumping it throughout the world. It's a problem for steel recyclers. Glass bottles. Glass bottles can go back into the same color, especially in a deposit state where you already have these colors separated. You can also, in dual stream programs, in some single stream, you can also, through the use of optical sorters, both at your MRF and at the receiving facility, get them also, in some cases, if the fragments are large enough, back into the original color. This happens with some of the glass that comes out that I put on the curbside because Montgomery County is dual stream, a bit cleaner glass than you're going to get in single stream. And some of that does get sold to glass companies to be made back into glass products. The other option is basic cullet. That's going to go to either fiberglass or it's going to go to aggregate markets. Now, glass is the one thing I don't track on a monthly basis. It's very simple. The price rarely changes. Since I've started doing this for NERC, glass prices have changed, I think, twice in those 4+ years. Flint, $57.50 a ton in dollars. Amber, brown is $37.50 a ton. Green is 10. Mixed, hey, you pay a price for it. You end up having to sell that for 10. You pay the secondary processor 15 a ton for your mix. And those prices, like I said, they're just very, very static. So what about
Chaz,
market? Yes.
you said aggregate is one of the markets. Can you just explain what aggregate is and how
Sure.
it's used? Thanks.
Aggregate is sort of a short term for anything but fiberglass or glass bottles. It can literally be aggregate that's used as fill in a lot of different uses. It can become some very specialty markets come out of aggregate. When you strike a match, there's actually a tiny amount of glass that helps with striking that match. It's just a wide variety of end products. It can be used to pave streets with. But they're very specialized markets and they tend to be fairly small. To get back to the market drivers, metals and glass share the same problem. They're very dependent on beverages. They're very dependent on alcoholic beverages. Beer consumption is now at its lowest point in 25 years. That obviously has had an impact on both aluminum can and on glass shipments. And glass is also having some issues because wine drinking is down. Society is shifting and what we drink, our beverages of choice. And it's happened to have a negative effect on these two materials. You also have the issue for metals of the Chinese overproduction that I mentioned. Let's look at corrugated boxes, also known as cardboard boxes. They become what's called linerboard and corrugated medium. The medium is that fluted material, the bigger thing you see, the wavy thing. The linerboard is on either side of that medium. Corrugated medium historically has had a lot of recycled content. Now it's joined by linerboard, which is having much more than before. And those, of course, are turned into new boxes. So you go from a box to the constituents of box, it goes to another mill where they're made into the actual boxes. OCC, odd spike right at the beginning of the pandemic when all your retail outlets were closed, and it got back, but at a good price. Spurted 21, the peak, went down, went very down at the end of 22, and since then it's been going up pretty steadily. A trend you're going to see in a number of other materials. We saw it in aluminum, this rise. Right now it's $110 a ton. It's great if you're selling. If you're buying, that's more than you want to pay. And all the end markets are feeling some stress because the higher price of OCC. Residential mixed paper can be just that. It's just about any kind of paper except for tissue paper and paper towels. So it's such a wide array of paper, and it can be turned into a very wide array of paper. It can be turned into, in this case, it's pizza boxes. You see some cup holders, you see some molded pulp, you see some paper products in there. Very versatile uses for residential mixed paper. Residential mixed paper prices just like corrugated. There is somebody talking in the background. I can hear very slightly.
Yeah, I'm going to find them and mute. Oh, here I can mute them.
Excellent.
There we go.
Thank you.
All right.
Same as OCC, they actually they operate at a discount to corrugated containers. They were actually below zero at one point. They were a negative $1.50, but then starting in March of last year, they started going up. They've continued to go up. They're currently at $67.50 per ton. It's a great market for residential mixed paper, unless you're the buyer. At NERC, we've been extensively tracking new paper recycled content capacity, starting in 2017 when a lot of corrugated mills saw opportunity in e-commerce and decided to expand the capacity, usually at a machine at that mill, or they decided to convert an existing, probably abandoned, printed paper machine into packaging paper, or they just decided to build a new mill. What you're looking at is the pulping machine for a new mill in the state of Washington. That, as you can tell by this photo, is a very, very large piece of equipment. It's very expensive, costs millions and millions and millions of dollars. And if you're a brand new mill, you're looking at spending $300 million, $400 million between siting, between permitting, and especially between equipment and everything it takes to build a new manufacturing facility. So what we've seen at NERC is 24 projects completed. We've seen a potential capacity increase of 8 million tons of new recycled content capacity. Now, some older, less efficient capacity is a closing because it cannot compete with this new, more efficient capacity. It's mostly virgin, but it's also some older recycled content capacity that's closing. One new facility opened this year. It's what's called a recycled fiber pulp facility. It's where you take these materials and instead of them turning them into, say, liner board or molded pulp, they turn them into pulp itself. They attempt to dry it somewhat, then they ship it out to a buyer. Most of these plants are designed for Chinese markets, but this particular one in Virginia is aiming more at domestic markets and use of this unusual pulp. Graphics paper is opening a new facility in Texas in 2026. At the same time, we've also seen some new facilities close. This one mill in Washington has announced it's likely to close, and they're saying there's just not enough demand for their boxes. I don't know how much of that is a regional issue. They've been kind of vague on all that, but it's just one of the realities of markets. There is a potential new mill in Nevada. I don't think that's going to be built. What about recycled paper exports? This is the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, very large operation, as you can see from this photo. Sort of raises the question, why do we export recyclables? The reason is very simple. Somebody else wants them more than we do, and they will pay more. So they pay more and they get more. Most of the recyclables we exported are either metals or they're paper. They're all measured in millions of tons. We don't really export aluminum cans, used aluminum cans. We don't really export the same with used steel cans or with glass cullet. And yes, we export plastic, which I'll get to later, but those are measured because they're so small comparatively. They tend to be measured in pounds, billions, and now hundreds of millions instead of actually in millions of tons. And this is what we see on recycled paper export. Starting looking back at 2016, about 21.7 million tons, went down, went up a bit. The Chinese put in some of the restrictions, went down, went up a little bit. Now they're just continuing to go down. Projecting from the first half of this year, it'll be about 13.25 million tons that we export. Less exports for two reasons. More domestic demand, all that new capacity in this country. And the economies in importing countries, for the most part, are not as strong. The four largest importing countries are India, Thailand, Malaysia, and Mexico. And the first three of those, the economies just aren't as strong as they were before. They just don't need the raw material or much. But the other impact of those exports is the irony that takes pressure off of prices in this country. I think if we were back to where we were in export markets, paper prices would be a little bit higher. Market drivers for recycled paper are very simple. There's demand, and the good news is containerboard production is up. All this new capacity is very aggressively competing for OCC and for RMP. And that higher price caused by that aggressive competition, as I noted, is causing a problem for mills. You look at the supply side. Last year, there was a real trend, and also in 2022, inflation at the grocery store, inflation at retail stores, you were paying more. And as those prices were going up, their unit sales were going down. Now, when unit sales go down, that means you need less raw materials for the product, and you don't need as many boxes to ship them from the manufacturer to the retailer. That meant containerboard production went down in 22 and 23. It's now coming back. But when it comes to supply, all those lower product sales, which still in some ways are going on, means that retail stores, the primary source of OCC, are generating less. And unfortunately, residential supply is not stepping up. The irony is we are actually importing a small amount of recycled paper from Canada just to help with supply in some parts of the country. Wild cards on paper markets, but the export markets remain soft. Will overall box production continue to increase? Are unit sales rising? I think unit sales are rising, but the data is a little murky, unfortunately. And what about e-commerce? Where is it going? E-commerce is the big savior of the corrugated industry. It definitely increased the sales of corrugated boxes in the aughts and in the teens. And that's when the paper industry started putting all this money into expanding their ability to make linerboard and medium and then turn it into boxes. We started tracking e-commerce, the Department of the Census, in 2005, I believe it was. It's about 5% of total retail sales by revenue. It's went up very slowly and steadily. Every quarter increased, maybe 1/10%, maybe 2/10. Before COVID, it was at about 15% of total retail sales, maybe 14%. It shot up to around 16% and peaked in the third quarter of 2020. And then it started going down when those retail stores started opening. Since then, it's sort of gotten back to its slow but steady increase. The real question, though, becomes how much will e-commerce continue to increase? When will it hit its inevitable top? Because we are a social species. We like to get out. We like to go to places to buy. We see friends. We see people. It's just inherent in who we are as humans. Let's switch over to plastics. Now, plastics are much more complicated than paper. Paper, you've got kraft and you got some groundwood, and that's it. Paper, 60% of it is packages. Plastics, you've got a slew of resins. Even within packaging, you've got 4 primary resin types. And you just have tremendous variety in how they come out. Makes it more complicated. PET bottles can be made back into PET bottles. And the good news is the beverage industry has really stepped up in its use of recycled content. Historically, fiber markets were the biggest market for PET bottles. In fact, PET recycling was actually invented by the plastic fiber industry, companies like Wellman back in the mid-'80s, to make rugs, to make clothing, to make insulation, and a whole bunch of other uses for fiber. The irony is that carpets are going out of fashion. Fiber sales are down, and that has given an opportunity for the soft drink industry to take over and be the bigger market for PET bottles. When we look at prices, again, the same weird up. In this case, it was in early 22. Goes down, then it goes up, it goes down, and then in July it starts going up again. And I think what has finally happened is PET is getting back into its normal seasonal flow. That big peak in the spring of 22 is blamed on the fiber industry for overbuying. They paid too much. They had warehouses that the sales were not what those procurement guys were anticipating. Price collapsed. It seems to be getting back on a normal kind of flow. PET bottles are 20.75 cents per pound right now in the Northeast. That is a great market for PET.
Hey, Chaz.
Yes.
On PET, I always heard that clothing was a significant market for it as well. Is that really not the case?
It's a big market
for polyester.
It's a big market, but fiber for rugs they'll pay more.
Oh, okay.
It gets into what the individual markets pay and the value of rugs. It's better than that for clothes. So, that's sort of the way it works.
High payer gets it.
And so much of fiber and so much clothing manufacturers left this country. It makes fiber for clothing less of an issue for within clothing made in this country.
Right.
Natural HDPE bottles, they're translucent, which means they're totally undyed. Because they're translucent, well, they're a small market in terms of it's primarily milk jugs, and milk sales have been flat for the last decade. It's not a growth market, so it's a limited supply. But what they go to primarily is to colored HDPE packaging: white, red, green, blue, orange, yellow, you name it. You can take that nice, clear, translucent resin and you can dye it into any color you want. But what does that mean for the colored HDPE? You can't take the color out of the resin. Once it's there, it's there. So you turn it into pipe. Who cares what color the pipe is? So the pipe is either going to be black, it's going to be white, it's going to last 50, maybe 100 years. It's a great end market. It displaces virgin plastics, but it's very dependent on one particular industry. So we see for prices for natural HDPE, the same up, big up in the summer of 21, goes down, it went up a bit. And then the reason given for the collapse in the spring of 23 was that market was dominated by one company, which was putting all its recycled content into one product. It sold that product. The new owners had no interest in paying extra for recycled content. And it's taken a while for that market to recover. But you see, it's been a very steady increase since the summer of 23. It's now up to 46.5 cents per pound. That is a good price for HDPE. I think it's going to keep going up. It's really now up to the brands. Brand demand seems to be back. They seem to be using it. How much more will they use? And that leads us to colored HDPE. Wow, look at all those ups and downs. Because the primary market is pipes, it's very dependent on the strength of housing construction and office building construction. And every peak there is pretty much correlated to housing starts in the second quarter of the year. And what we are seeing, prices go up as housing starts to go up, then they go down for various reasons. It depends how quick and how much. But every year since 2019, housing starts in the second quarter have been lower than the preceding year. And you see how it's plunged now from May until August. It's down to 9.5 cents per pound, a stunningly low price for colored HDPE. The good news, the mortgage rate is dropping. Hopefully there'll be an increase in housing starts, or some of the recycled content laws will pick up, and some of the brands are now going to have to pay for color sorted colored HDPE resin. But when they pay for that, that is much more expensive than buying natural. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. Polypropylene, yes.
So for the color sorting, so is that when the materials recovery facilities, the MRFs, have optical sorters, or is that after?
That's after. That's at the intermediate processor. There are companies who have the equipment to color sort there. It's just more expensive. You got to pay for the equipment. Got to pay for, you just got to pay for the extra cost.
That makes sense.
Polypropylene packaging, it's like natural HDPE. It's a fairly small impact on packages. That yogurt, for instance, a lot of dairy products can be found in polypropylene. The market paint pails or a lot of durable plastics, battery casings, toys, garden instruments. And the problem with durable plastics as a market is that has not been a very happy industry since COVID began. A lot of their sales have gone down. They're doing what they can. There seem to be some upticks, but we're just not seeing. In fact, it's been called something of a plastics recession because of the impact on the durable side of the plastics industry. So you look at polypropylene, you see two weird jumps, then you see going down. It was very flat for most of a year at 5 cents a pound. It's gone up since then. It's actually up to 9 cents. This absolutely surreal instance where polypropylene is almost more valuable than colored HDPE, which is just so unusual. And there's a very simple reason for why that price has gone up. There's a new wash line that's coming into operation at KW Plastics, which is one of the biggest buyers of recycled polypropylene. They need more supply. They need to build up the supply lines, so they're paying more. Look at new plastic recycled content. This slot is from EFS Plastics. They're a Canadian-based company with two facilities in Canada and one in Pennsylvania. And they use the slide to show both the resin pellets they produce, but also the way they can dye them any color you want. It's a lot harder to track plastic recycled content. These are much smaller facilities. They require much less money. So what you often see is, instead of some of the very detailed financial industry out of the data out of the paper industry, you see press releases announcing new capacity is going to build. And then hopefully you see a press release announcing the new capacity was built. And there's a lot less of those than the former. And then hopefully a year or two later, a press release saying what the facility is actually doing. What we are seeing on the plastic side is a lot of press releases announcing lines, new facilities coming online. We're seeing like press releases of supply agreements with various recycling companies. Republic Services now has got a plastics process facility. Actually, it'll be their second one. And unfortunately, we don't see a lot, though, of press releases about how these new facilities are working. We did see the wrong one for MyPlas, which was a facility in Rogers, Minnesota, that opened to great fanfare in December of last year, and it closed for downtime in March. And it's not, to the best of my knowledge, reopened. Nobody knows quite what went wrong there, but it's not what you want to see. Look at recycled plastics exports projected from the first half. You see how they went down so dramatically from 2017. I think it was like 3.7 billion pounds, down when the Chinese embargo started, down to a little under 1.5 billion, going down even more. 2002, it got under 1 billion pounds. It's upper 900 million pounds. And it's just going to stay there for a long time. It primarily goes to, well, over 50% goes to either Canada or Mexico. Again, EFS and some other companies. And then the rest goes to Thailand, Malaysia, one or two other countries. And it's primarily either non-rigid bottles, polyethylenes, or film and other mixed plastics. Again, primarily polyethylenes. And we just don't have the markets for that in this country yet. So I think it's going to be a while before that export number drops anymore. But again, put it in perspective. This is pounds. It is not tons. Okay, market drivers for recycled plastics. Biggest problem is very simple. Recycled plastic used to be less expensive than virgin. That's not the case anymore. There's too much virgin resin. There's too much domestic off-spec. And there's too much cheap recycled resin imports. We are actually a net importer of recycled plastic resins, not a net exporter of recycled plastics. You have the seasonal issue for PET. You've got the single family housing start issue for colored HDPE. Single family houses were down significantly year over year in July. Large projects were up, but you even it all out, overall starts are down. And the bigger problem, consumer spending on goods remains soft. This issue of a plastic recession for durable goods. Good news is consumer spending on durables went up second quarter to first quarter to the second. And we know that electronics and appliance store sales went up 5.5% year over year. There's a lot of plastic in those products. The other wild card, hurricane season. It's off to a very intense start. We've already had the B and the D, and this is only mid-August. And a lot of our petrochemical capacity is in Texas, in the Gulf Coast. And those hurricanes can hit there, and it's very bad for the petrochemical industry. It's not bad for plastic recycling because it forces a shortage of virgin material, but you still have the recyclable plastic available. But it's not the way you want to make see products and markets improve. At NERC, we also track per ton value and MRF bale value. Aluminum, obviously the biggie, almost $1,600 a ton, followed by natural, is getting really close to 1,000 a ton, PET at 400. Then it goes down, and then you see OCC and you see residential mix. They look pretty small, 110, 67. But then you look at this in terms of an average bale ton with residual costs, and we have the data through the first quarter. We started doing this in the second quarter of 2010. This is kind of imperfect data in some ways because it's hard to get data and it's hard to get it into the format, but there's a very clear trend here. When markets are strong, bale prices are strong. And it's a mix of two things. I look at a recycling bale as being like a cake. The paper is the substance of that cake in terms of weight and in terms of volume. The aluminum, the natural HDPE, the PET, that's, if you will, the icing on the cake. So when the two are strong, those prices go up. And right now it's being pushed up more by the strength of paper than the other materials. So where are markets headed? I got some ideas. This slide actually comes from when markets were really weird about 2 years ago, and it was very hard to predict. But the biggest problem is this. We're in a COVID economy still. And when I took Econ 101 many decades ago, my professor never used the term pandemic. Nobody had an idea what the impact of a pandemic would be on the economy. We've learned a lot, and it's really all about, when you look at recycling markets, where is the economy going? Now, traditionally in this slide, it's been an economy in a recession or a soft landing. It's generally agreed we're not going to go into a recession. We're going into some kind of a soft landing. In that first bullet, you see a lot of the stuff that economists love to track. Inflation is easing, GDP growth is up, job growth is slowing, blah, blah, blah. Then you get down to retail sales. Everybody was overjoyed when the latest monthly retail sales data was up. Retail sales were up 1%. Great. But turns out that 60% of that has to do with auto sales, and it's a sort of a reaction to the cybersecurity problems the automobile industry suffered in May and a little bit of June. 4% of that, or 40% of that 1% increase was unit sales, was more revenue up. But again, you look at what those purchasing agents are doing when they're making their bets on the future. They think manufacturing activity is going down. 48.5 in June. Their prediction was 46.5 in July. That's what they expected. Well, that's what they got, was 46.5 in July. 49.3 was the number in June. It was 47.4 in July. Both are down. Both are in contraction. And that 47.4 is new orders. That's when they're predicting the future, not where they're saying the present is, but where they're buying in the future, and they continue to be pessimistic about the future. It's not badly pessimistic, but it is definitely in what ISM, the Institute of Supply Managers, calls a contracting economy. Conversely, services, they're pretty optimistic about services. And this is one of the interesting things about COVID, that we spend more on services since COVID began. And by services, we mean experiences, vacations, going to the restaurant, going to a movie, than we do on goods, stuff, products. And it looks like that's going to continue. Now, consumer sentiment went down, although it went up in the latest August data. But I'm less interested in consumer sentiment than in consumer spending. And that has clearly been tightening. And all throughout 2023, you would read quarterly reports from all the big brands talking about, yeah, revenue is up. I think I said this before, that was inflation. But unit sales were down, and that was inflation too. So beginning this year, starting in spring, they started cutting prices to increase unit sales. Cutting prices that would lower revenue, perhaps, but they'd sell more products, get more people back into the store. Walmart announced last week its second quarter retail data. Sales were up. Unit sales were definitely up. And Walmart announced in that report another 7,200 price cuts on products in their stores. So what do we have going on? Are consumers simply switching to less expensive products? That is happening. Different stores, that is happening. Or are they just not buying more? I don't think it's the not buying more anymore. I think it's they're simply switching to less expensive products. But the good news, they all need packages. They all need boxes to be shipped in. So I think we're seeing some good news on the unit sales side. So let's look at markets beyond July. Paper. Well, the price is strong, but a drop is inevitable. It's just when. I think you're going to see the prices soften in December for a very simple reason. Back to school days and Halloween, there's a lot of boxes ordered specifically for those, for products, kids going back to school. All the Halloween stuff, which you're already seeing for sale now. Last time I checked, it's August. Halloween's at the end of October, but all this stuff was already in stores. But they still have to make the boxes for holiday demand. And what is Black Friday? It's the day after Thanksgiving. And then that holiday demand continues throughout December. They're making the boxes and they're making the products for those material, they're making the boxes for the packages, and they're making the products themselves now in anticipation for what they'll be selling in October and November and December. And that's why in December, I think these prices are inevitably going to soften. I just don't see how it can be avoided unless export demand suddenly increases. Plastic, PET, those seasonal sales, it's going to soften at the end of the month. Natural HDPE, I hope I'm right that it's increased brand demand to meet goals. Color HDPE, it's not going to be helped until housing starts to go back up. The good news is mortgage rates saw a cut, and hopefully we'll see more of that. Polypropylene, definitely benefiting from that soon to open wash line at KW, and hopefully that will continue. What about other markets beyond July? Well, aluminum, it's got that seasonal reality to deal with. Steel is down. I think it's going to go down a little bit more because of the whole problem with imports and what's right now for steel, a little bit slower construction, but it's more the problem of imported cheap steel from other countries, primarily China. And as for glass, I just don't see glass prices getting any better until sales improve dramatically. So some final thoughts on market trends. I'm modestly optimistic. Paper demand is good. Plastics are slowly improving. Metals are normal for aluminum, soft for steel, glass is flat. I look at my charts, 3 of the materials are flat, paper and the 2 paper and steel. Aluminum, but they're good prices in all cases. 3 plastics are up, and that is very encouraging to see plastics increasing in value. And it's just, steel is soft and color HDPE is soft. So that's I've done these presentations and I've been very pessimistic. I think these are basically good trends for markets, frankly, better than I was seeing in June or in July. I do include on these slides something called good reads. These are things I've seen in the press that have sort of, I think they say things about the economy. They say things about where materials are going. These are the sources that I use in this presentation. And this is my contact data. As I said earlier, all my slides will be available on a PDF. So you will have all the speaker notes. And I've got some somewhat substantial speaker notes in some places. And I hope you'll find that beneficial. I will get the final one of that off to John right after this is over. So John, I guess I hit escape. And I get out of this.
At the top, there's a red thing that should say stop sharing.
Done.
All right.
So I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you, Chaz. That was great and detailed. And this is where folks can put their questions, either raise their hand or put your question in the Q&A. I'm going to try to make that disappear. All right, there we go. All right, well, I'll get the questions and answers started. One thing you mentioned once on the slide on plastics markets exports and the whole national sword thing, China's embargo. When was that, and and what was it, and how are the ramifications
Good
shaking
question.
out?
There were two Chinese initiatives, actually. One was called, if my memory is right, Green Fence, and that was in 2014. And that's when they were cracking down on waste that was found in bales of recyclables. Now, there's this amazing myth that we send all our waste to China. Or there's this myth that we send waste disguised as recyclables to China. That's actually not true. However, one reality of the recycling industry has been there have been unscrupulous dealers in the recycling industry. Some who would salt a bale of waste with recyclables as the cover, especially when the markets were good. And that, in fact, was happening to an extent. I'd seen the bales at some MRFs, and I was surprised they were being shipped overseas because you could see contamination in them. And in that case, they were being accepted by Chinese mills who were just cleaning them up on their own. Chinese government got tired of that. They said no. Good for them. They should have said that earlier. It wasn't that was a lot, but there was enough to be a problem. And I also think they saw some propaganda value internally in doing that. Then you switch to 2017, they announced what they called the National Sword, which was actually an anti-smuggling operation because some recyclables were being smuggled into China. And that turned into a ban on the imports of virtually all plastics and the imports of virtually all, but not all paper. And not really a ban on the import of steel. You can still get a lot of metals into China. They also did not ban the import of recycled fiber pulp. They were quite happy to get that. But there's not a lot of recycled fiber pulp made. It's either made in mills near China and then just shipped over the border, or there's made in a couple of mills in this country and maybe in Europe, I'm not sure. And right now, because of the nature of the Chinese economy, they don't need it. So those pulp shipments from this country have all but dried up because there's just not a market for it right now. And that's not going to change until the Chinese economy gets healthy, and they're just doing a bang up job of messing up their economy right now.
All right, great. Thank you for that. That was a good one. We have another question from Megan at NERC. How do you see improved infrastructure, access, and education for recycling affecting or impacting demand for recyclables?
Oddly, the bigger the supply, the more likely prices are to go down, even as it fills up the demand. But I don't think that's going to be an immediate problem at all. In terms of infrastructure, it takes a while to expand infrastructure. It takes a while, especially if it's a new MRF. You got to get it sited, you got to get it permitted, then you got to get all the equipment, and the supply line is tight. It can take you, and even if you're going to replace an existing MRF, you still have to get the equipment and you have to get it installed. And there's a limited number of companies that make equipment, and a bunch of them happen to be located in Europe. So you're now competing with European buyers, and you got to get them over here on boat. So it's going to take a while to truly build up the infrastructure. It just does not happen overnight. But I think on the whole, it's good. I think better education is important. But we have to sort of accept the fact that there is a very stubborn percent of the American public that has no interest in recycling. Or perhaps more kindly said, they have other priorities in life. And recycling is not one of them. And, I get that. There's 330 million of us. You just can't get all 330 million Americans to agree on anything. And that reality is out there, and I don't think we know how to deal with it in terms of education. It's going to take time. It's going to take really building up a true recycling culture in this country, and that too is going to take time.
Yeah, that makes me think of the old adage where it's 20% will do it even if it's really hard. 60% will do it if it becomes easy and normal. And there's 20% that still will never do it.
Yeah,
So,
it's just not in their wheelhouse.
yeah. Looks like we have another question. I can't see your name, but it's Jim Hebert. You can unmute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
thank you.
Hi. So I saw you mention PET and fibers. Listening recently on a California Care call, they really want to see the PET out of the carpet fibers over there and what place with nylon 6. How do you feel that would affect the PET and plastics market if they were to shift that dynamic over in
So
California?
California wants PET only in bottles?
They want it out of the carpet at least because that affects Care's recycling goals.
Well, they'll have to persuade the other fiber users to pay more than the carpet industry.
Huh.
I don't, it's very nice of what CARE wants and what the state wants, but it's what markets pay that makes the difference. And the reality that is, carpets just aren't the industry they used to be. So their sales are down, but you get the bottle guys to pay more, and you get the other fiber users to pay more, and that'll take care of carpets.
All right. All right. Thank you.
Good question. Anyone else popping up? I'll keep going with some more questions that I had. Which materials are most affected globally by global markets versus domestic markets? I mean, it sounds like, steel obviously is global. Old corrugated cardboard is the pulp moves around all over the place. But glass, is that more just domestic? Where's the big boys that are going around the world, and what materials stay at home?
The global market becomes an issue, and you're talking about just the overall global economy. Is the world humming along nicely economically, or are we in a recession worldwide? If we're in a worldwide recession, then prices are going down, and that's that. When it comes to individual materials, glass is a good example of a fairly insulated product. Glass is really subject to much more local demand issues for the product itself. And it's worth noting with glass that they on a tonnage basis, they make as much in terms of glass bottles this year, or in 2018, as they did in 1970. It's an industry that grew rapidly after 1970, and since then has shrunk because there's just less demand for the products that are in glass. It is what it is. Lighter weight products, plastic really, really had a very heavy impact on glass, as did, for that matter, aluminum. You have a lot of local economies. Europe can have different realities than the United States, for instance. Europe has to deal immediately with the impact of the war in Ukraine. We don't. So that's had an impact on both paper prices, and it's had an impact on plastic prices in Europe. And it's actually forced some of those prices down. And I don't know if I mentioned in the presentation, we actually import more plastic recycled plastic resins and whatnot than we used to, than we export, which is a stunning change. And it's part of that is the shift that's going on in Europe. They need to send some of their resins elsewhere.
That makes sense. It's all flowing around.
Yeah.
All right, I've got one last question for you. It's a little bit political so I'm going to start with a caveat. This is, I'm asking you personally. This is not this does not reflect the opinions of our member states. But recycled content mandates are showing up more and more. Do you think that in the long run, will have a positive impact on recycling and recycling markets, requiring a certain amount of recycled content in a new bottle or whatever?
The answer to that is, first you look at the history of recycled content for newsprint, for newspapers. I actually testified before Congress in 1994 in favor of recycled content laws for newsprint. It's back when I worked at NSWMA, and our members thought it would be great for newsprint. Congress never passed a law, but there were a lot of state laws, and there was tremendous demand by the newspaper industry for recycled content, some because of state laws, some because the industry had resolved two technical problems. One had to do with the ability to use color ink, and they figured out how to do that so the ink wouldn't spread all over the paper. And the other was how to run recycled newsprint at the high heat intensity speeds of the modern newspaper machines. So, hey, technology fixed it. The demand was there, and it was great, except prices still fluctuated because you got the economy to deal with, and demand for newspapers goes up and down. And we know what happened to the overall demand for newspapers. It went way down. So yeah, it was great for a while, but it still fluctuated according to the economy. When it comes to plastics, well, as chair of the Maryland Recycling Network's legislative committee, I've testified, I think, 3 times now in Annapolis in favor of recycled content laws, but our testimony has been a little bit nuanced. We pointed out those laws have to take into account product loss of the material. They have to take into account reasonable estimates of supply. It gets back to not everybody's going to supply the raw material. And it has to get back to the reality of competing markets. So if you know that, say, you're going to lose 15% of the PET or the natural HDPE simply during processing and collection, and processing because of all that shredding and dust blowing around and what have you, and then perhaps in the manufacturing process itself, you know, that's already a limit on what a law can get. And if you're only going to get half the bottles, that's another limit. So why are you setting a 50% recycling level when it's probably impossible? And then you throw in competing markets. If you know, I actually heard of one attempted law on PET that would have declared that any non-bottle use of PET for recycling was not considered recycling. That is absolutely outrageous. That reflects stunning greed on the part of the soft drink and beverage industry. They should be ashamed of themselves for that language, because my understanding, and I apologize if I'm wrong that it's their language, but that's my understanding of where it came from. There are other markets out there, and that's the reality of HDPE. Those pipe markets have been just so important for HDPE in the years. And if you get into a bidding contest and the piping industry can pay more than the packaging industry, that's a reality you got to deal with. So we said in Maryland, we love the idea. We think it's very helpful, but you got to be very, very careful with the target pick.
Right. That sounds good. And you just have to be very thoughtful and understand the whole life cycle of these materials. All right. Well, I think we've run out all our time. So thank you very much, Chaz. That was
my
a
pleasure.
terrific presentation. We had